Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. My Black Ops team wakes after 30 years frozen. Earth is now a wasteland of parasites. The first sensation wasn't the cold, though that came later, seeping through my bones like liquid nitrogen poured directly into my marrow. No, the first thing I felt was the wrongness. Something fundamental had shifted in the world while I slept, and my body knew it before my mind had even begun to catch up. The taste came next. Copper pennies and something else, something organic and rotten that made every survival instinct I possessed start screaming. But when you've been frozen for what feels like forever, screaming is about as useful as praying to a god who stopped listening years ago. Captain Dorian Hale, serial number 7749, Delta 6, 42 years old when they put me on ice, though I felt closer to 100 now. The basics. Hold on to the basics. Everything else would come back eventually, except the mission parameters had called for 5 years maximum. The readout glowing sickly green above my head told a different story. 2054. 30 goddamn years. The cryogenic chamber wheezed around me like a dying man's last breath. Emergency power cycling through circuits that should have failed decades ago. Hydraulics groaned and protested as they fought to bring me back from whatever passes for death in a freezer tube. Around me, 4 other pods were cycling through their own revival sequences, but the sounds were all wrong. Too much strain in the machinery. Too much desperation in the way the systems fought to drag us back to the world of the living. "Well, Jesus Christ on a cracker," came Lieutenant Sarah Rourke's voice from Pod 3, cutting through the mechanical symphony like a rusty blade through silk. She always recovered fastest from everything. Bullets, bourbon, betrayal, you name it. Please tell me we overslept because the war ended and they're throwing us a goddamn ticker tape parade. I tried to answer and nearly choked on the coating of synthetic fluid still clinging to my throat. When words finally came, they belonged to a stranger who borrowed my voice box. "Negative on the parade, Rourke. We've got problems." The woman who climbed out of Pod 3 looked like she'd aged a decade during the sleep. Sarah Rourke had always been sharp-featured, all angles and attitude, but now there was something hollow in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She'd been our demolitions expert and secondary tactical officer, the kind of soldier who could blow up a building with surgical precision or take out a sniper at 300 yards with her eyes closed. More than that, she'd been the heart of our unit, the one who kept us laughing when the world went to hell around us. "Problems," she repeated, testing the word like it might explode in her mouth. "Fantastic, because the last 30 years were going so well." Sergeant Kellen Ward emerged from his chamber like a man climbing out of his own grave, which considering the circumstances might not have been far from the truth. At 45, he'd been our old man when we went under, the steady presence who patched us up after firefights and talked us through the nightmares afterward. 6 tours in places the Pentagon pretended didn't exist had left him with steady hands and a voice that could calm panicked soldiers in the middle of a mortar barrage. Now he looked like time had chewed him up and spat him back out, but his hands were still steady as he checked his pulse against his wrist, counted heartbeats, tested his reflexes. 20 years of battlefield medicine had taught him to trust procedures over feelings, and old habits died hard. Vitals are within acceptable parameters, he reported in that clinical tone that had kept him sane through countless triage situations. Blood pressure elevated but stabilizing. Muscle atrophy, consistent with extended hibernation. But something's interfering with the facility's primary power grid. We're running on backup systems that should have failed 20 years ago. Ward had always been our anchor. The man who kept us grounded when operations went sideways and the mission parameters started resembling wishful thinking more than actual plans. He'd saved more lives than he'd taken, which in our line of work made him something approaching a saint. Corporal Marcus Briggs unfolded from his reinforced pod like a mountain deciding to take a walk. At 6'8" and built like a walking tank, he'd needed special accommodations even for the cryo system. He'd been our heavy weapons specialist and unofficial team philosopher, a gentle giant who could discuss Nietzsche and then put a .50 caliber round through a target at 1,000 yards without blinking. But as he looked around the dimly lit chamber, I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Marcus Briggs, the man who'd stared down entire tank columns and laughed about it afterward, looked genuinely afraid. "Captain," he said quietly, and that soft tone was more terrifying than if he'd been screaming. Briggs only got quiet when things were really catastrophically bad. "You need to look at this. All of you." Private Tommy Lane sat up in his pod like a man waking from a nightmare he couldn't shake. 23 years old when they'd frozen us, fresh out of advanced training, and still young enough to believe that good guys always won, and bad guys always got what was coming to them. He'd been our communications specialist and backup sniper, eager as a puppy, and twice as loyal. The expression on his face suggested that particular worldview had just taken a sledgehammer to the skull and was lying in pieces on the floor. I followed his horrified stare into the shadows beyond our revival bay and felt reality take a sharp left turn into territory that didn't belong on any map I'd ever seen. Stretching away into the darkness were dozens of additional cryogenic chambers, but these weren't part of our scheduled wake-up call. Each pod held a human figure, perfectly preserved and very much awake. Their eyes tracked our movement with the patience of apex predators, glowing dull crimson like dying coals in the emergency lighting. "Nobody moves," I ordered, my voice carrying the authority of a man who'd led soldiers through 7 different kinds of hell and managed to bring most of them home. The flashlight from my emergency kit flickered to life, batteries wheezing, but still functional enough to illuminate the nightmare we'd awakened into. The nearest chamber held Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. 8 years I'd known him, served beside him in Syria, Kazakhstan, and half a dozen other places where American soldiers weren't supposed to be. Miguel Rodriguez had been a good soldier and a better friend, the kind of man who'd give you his last cigarette and then ask to borrow one back 5 minutes later. He'd saved my life twice and never let me forget it. The thing wearing Rodriguez's face wasn't him anymore. Its eyes followed my flashlight beam with predatory focus that made my skin crawl. Its mouth moved against the glass viewing port, forming words that carried no sound, but somehow conveyed a hunger so profound it reached into my chest and squeezed. When its breath fogged the chamber window, the condensation didn't form random patterns. It was deliberate, organized, like some alien language written in human exhalation. "Jesus Christ," Ward whispered, moving to check the pod's monitoring systems with the methodical precision of a man who'd learned to trust instruments over instincts. "According to this, he's alive. Heart rate steady, brain activity normal, all vital signs within acceptable parameters." But alive wasn't the right word for what we were looking at. This was something else entirely. Something that wore life like an ill-fitting costume. "Sir," Rourke said, her voice carrying that particular tone she got when she was trying very hard not to panic. "Look at the others." I swept my light across the chamber, illuminating row after row of occupied pods. Soldiers I recognized, men and women I'd served with, fought beside, mourned when they didn't make it home. All of them awake, all of them watching us with those terrible crimson eyes. "How long have they been like this?" Lane asked, his voice cracking like a teenager's. Before anyone could answer, a klaxon shrieked through the facility, cutting through the oppressive silence like a scream. Rodriguez's pod began its emergency release sequence, steam venting from the seals as warning lights bathed everything in hellish red. The chamber door swung open with the wet, organic sound of flesh parting. He tumbled onto the floor like a marionette with cut strings, his body convulsing as if 10,000 volts were coursing through his nervous system. When those crimson eyes found us, they held intelligence, but it was alien intelligence wearing a familiar face like a mask that didn't quite fit. Rodriguez moved like liquid death, covering 20 feet of distance in the time it took my brain to process what I was seeing. But it wasn't just the speed that made my blood run cold. He moved wrong, too fluid, too coordinated, like he was being operated by something that had studied human movement extensively but had never quite mastered the subtle imperfections that made it natural. Ward barely managed to get his arms up before Rodriguez crashed into him, fingers that had once been steady enough for field surgery, now clawing at his throat with desperate alien hunger. The medic's training kicked in immediately. He knew exactly where to strike to disable an attacker, but Rodriguez absorbed blows that should have shattered bone and kept coming. Briggs reacted with the mechanical precision of a man who'd spent 20 years in close-quarters combat. His massive fist connected with Rodriguez's skull in a blow that should have painted the walls with brain matter and put him down permanently. Instead, Rodriguez twisted at impossible angles, his spine bending in ways that would have killed any normal person instantly. "Light him up," I barked, drawing my sidearm from the emergency holster. 30 years of artificial sleep hadn't erased muscle memory. The weapon came up smooth as silk, and I put 3 rounds center mass with textbook precision. Black fluid exploded from the wounds instead of blood. Not the crimson spray I expected, but something dark and viscous that moved with apparent purpose, reaching towards us like it was actively hunting for new hosts. Rodriguez staggered under the impact but kept fighting, black ichor streaming from his chest without seeming to slow him down. Rourke appeared beside him like an angel of death, her service weapon pressed against his temple with the cold professionalism of someone who'd done this dance too many times before. "Sweet dreams, asshole," she said, and pulled the trigger. Rodriguez's head snapped back in a spray of that same dark fluid, but even then his body kept twitching and convulsing for long, horrible seconds. When he finally went still, the black substance leaking from his wounds began forming thin tendrils that reached toward our boots with blind but determined persistence. "What in the name of all that's holy was that thing?" Lane stammered, backing away from the spreading pool of darkness like it might come alive and grab him. Ward knelt beside the corpse despite every survival instinct screaming at him to run, his medical training overriding fear with the methodical curiosity that had kept him alive through 6 tours of hell. "This isn't human biology anymore," he said, pointing to the bullet wounds with a steady hand. "Look at this, no blood, no normal tissue response to trauma. It's like something was wearing his body like a suit." As he spoke, the black substance began pulsing with a rhythm that was almost like a heartbeat. Almost, but not quite. Too fast, too irregular, like something that had learned to mimic life without truly understanding its fundamental rhythms. Rourke's boot heel came down on the reaching tendrils with decisive force, crushing them with a wet, organic sound that made my stomach turn. Where she'd stepped, the metal floor began smoking slightly, as if the substance was mildly corrosive. "We need to move topside," I decided, holstering my weapon and moving toward the exit. "Right now." But as we prepared to leave, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. More pods were beginning their revival sequences, emergency lights blinking as automated systems responded to some unknown trigger. The facility was waking up its sleeping occupants, and something told me we didn't want to be here when that process completed. The facility's corridors stretched ahead of us like the gullet of some massive beast, emergency lighting flickering sporadically and casting shadows that turned every corner into a potential ambush. Our footsteps echoed off the metal walls with hollow percussion, but underneath that familiar sound was something else, a subtle vibration in the air, as if the facility itself had learned to breathe. We moved in standard formation, Briggs on point with his massive frame, serving as our human shield, Rourke covering our six with the paranoid vigilance of someone who'd survived too many firefights, Ward and Lane protected in the middle where medical expertise and communications could be preserved. But 30 years of artificial sleep had left us rusty, our timing off by fractions of seconds that could mean the difference between life and death. More troubling, the facility had changed. Corridors that should have led directly to surface access now dead-ended at blast doors that hadn't been there before. Emergency exits had been welded shut from the inside, the metal still bearing scorch marks from cutting torches. Someone had turned our extraction route into a maze, and I had a sinking feeling about who that someone might have been. "Sir," Ward called from what used to be a break room, his voice carrying that particular note of concern that made experienced soldiers pay attention. The furniture was overturned and arranged in a crude but desperate-looking barricade facing the entrance, but whatever they'd been trying to keep out had clearly gotten through. The makeshift fortification was torn apart from within, scattered across the room like broken toys. Dark stains decorated the walls, in patterns that told a story no one wanted to read, and the air still carried the metallic tang of old violence, mixed with something else, something organic and wrong that made my nostrils burn. A computer terminal in the corner still had partial power, its screen flickering with the dying gasps of a system that had been running on fumes for longer than it was designed to last. Ward coaxed it to life with the gentle persistence of someone who'd learned to make broken things work just long enough to save lives. What we found there painted a picture that made our situation infinitely worse. Day 347. First signs of infection detected in Research Lab C. Subjects showing rapid cellular modification at unprecedented rates. Recommend immediate implementation of quarantine protocols and evacuation of non-essential personnel. Day 623. The parasites are adapting faster than we can study them. They're not just infecting tissue, they're actively rewriting it, improving it, making it better than baseline human norms. Infected hosts demonstrate enhanced strength, speed, and resilience that defies current understanding of human physiology. Day 891. We've lost containment on multiple levels. The infected are showing coordinated behavior patterns suggesting some form of collective intelligence, directing their actions. They learn from each encounter, adapting their tactics in real time based on our defensive measures. Day 1247. Dear God, they can mimic voices now. Perfect vocal reproduction, including inflection, speech patterns, even personal mannerisms specific to individuals. Yesterday I spent 20 minutes having what I thought was a normal conversation with my wife, before realizing she'd been dead for 3 weeks. Day 1693. The cryo bay has been completely compromised. The parasites are somehow using our preservation systems to keep infected hosts alive indefinitely, while they breed inside them. We cannot shut down the pods without releasing hundreds of infected simultaneously. We're trapped by our own technology. Day 2156. They're not just copying voices anymore. They're copying entire people, using genetic material extracted from the cryo systems to create perfect physical duplicates. How do you fight an enemy that literally wears your own face? Day 2489. All surface contact has been lost. No response from any outside military installations or government facilities. We have to assume the infection has reached major population centers. America may be lost. The world may be lost. Final entry, day 2891. We've sealed the facility and activated full lockdown protocols. The infection has been contained for 8 years, but we're dying one by one. If anyone ever reads this log, do not attempt to leave. Do not try to make contact with the outside world. The surface may already belong to them. We've become guardians of humanity's grave. 2,891 days, Lane said, his young voice hollow as a tomb. That's almost 8 years they fought these things, before they finally gave up hope. They didn't give up hope, Rourke corrected, running her fingers along deep gouges in the wall that looked suspiciously like claw marks. They made a tactical decision. They locked themselves in here with these parasites to prevent them from spreading to the rest of the world. Fat lot of good it did, Briggs muttered, examining blast door controls that had been systematically destroyed. If those things have been down here for 30 years, multiplying... He didn't need to finish the thought. We all understood the mathematics of exponential growth, especially when applied to hostile organisms with perfect hosts and unlimited time. But as we reached the surface access tunnel, it became abundantly clear that their sacrifice had been meaningless. The massive blast doors, designed to survive direct nuclear attack, had been peeled back like flower petals, revealing gouges in the reinforced steel that could only have been made by something with incredible strength and razor-sharp natural weapons. Beyond the destroyed entrance lay a world that belonged in humanity's worst nightmares. The sky was the colour of dried blood, choked with dust and strange spores that fell like diseased snow. What had once been Pine Ridge Military Installation, one of America's most secure facilities, now looked like the surface of an alien world. Buildings were collapsed and overgrown, with bioluminescent vines that pulsed with sickly light, creating a landscape that hurt to look at for too long. In the distance, the skeletal remains of Colorado Springs reached towards the poison sky, like the bones of some massive creature that had never been meant to die. The city that had once housed nearly 500,000 people was now a graveyard of twisted metal and organic growth that defied classification. The air was technically breathable, but it carried the taste of copper and decay, with an underlying sweetness that reminded me of fruit left too long in the summer sun. Every surface was coated with a thin film of that same black substance we'd seen in Rodriguez's wounds, and I swear it moved when we weren't looking directly at it, shifting and flowing like it was somehow alive. My dear God, Ward breathed, something fundamental breaking in his voice as he took in the scope of the devastation. The entire world. We picked our way through the wasteland past the twisted remains of burned-out vehicles and desperate fortifications that told the story of humanity's final stand against something it couldn't understand or defeat. Tank treads were embedded in the hardened earth like fossils from a war that had ended before it truly began. The twisted wreckage of military aircraft created a sculpture garden of failed resistance, their weapons still pointed skyward at enemies they'd never been able to reach. In the ruins of what had once been the base commissary, Rourke found a journal wedged under a collapsed beam, its pages yellow with age but still readable. Day unknown. We stopped counting after the first 1,000. They came from deep underground, from caves and tunnel systems we didn't even know existed. The infection spreads through any kind of bodily fluid contact. Blood, saliva, even concentrated sweat if the viral hero load is high enough. But calling it infection doesn't do justice to what actually happens. They don't want to kill the host. They want to perfect it. The infected don't die in any meaningful sense, they just stop being human. Their eyes turn that terrible red colour, their reflexes become superhuman, and they develop some kind of collective intelligence that allows them to coordinate like a single massive organism. They hunt in packs with tactical precision that would make special forces jealous, and they learn from every single encounter, adapting their strategies based on our defensive measures. But the worst part, God help us, the worst part, is what they do to the corpses. The parasites don't just animate dead tissue like some kind of zombie movie. They use human remains as raw material for construction. They can grow new limbs, modify bone structure, even create entirely new organisms from harvested human parts. We found one of their nests yesterday, a writhing mass of human tissue that had been woven together into something that defied every law of biology we thought we understood. It was beautiful and terrible and absolutely, undeniably alive. When threatened, infected hosts can literally burst open like seed pods, releasing dozens of new parasites to find fresh victims. Each parasite carries genetic material from every previous host it's inhabited. They're not just copying us, they're stealing pieces of our humanity and using them to build something new and improved. We tried fighting them with conventional weapons, but bullets are essentially useless against something that can regrow lost tissue in a matter of minutes. Fire works temporarily, but they adapt to that too. We've seen infected hosts covered in some kind of natural fire retardant like living asbestos that protects them from flame weapons. The government stopped responding to our communications 6 weeks ago. We have to assume the infection has reached all major population centers. America is lost. The world may be lost. If anyone ever finds this record, remember, they're not zombies or mindless monsters. They're highly intelligent hunters, and we are the prey they have been specifically designed to catch. Every human being they convert makes the collective smarter, stronger, and better at hunting the rest of us. God help us all, they're perfect. The word hung in the air between us like a curse, and I found myself thinking about evolution and adaptation and all the ways that nature found to improve upon its mistakes. Humanity had always assumed we were the end point of evolution, the final product of millions of years of natural selection. Maybe we'd been wrong about that. We need to get back inside, I decided after a long moment of staring at the devastation. If there are more of those things still in the facility... My words were cut off by the sound of laughter echoing from the tunnel entrance behind us. Not human laughter, but something that had learned the basic mechanics of the sound without truly understanding its emotional context. It was followed by voices calling our names, familiar voices that made my blood run cold. Tommy? The call drifted up from the darkness below us, a perfect reproduction of Lane's own voice, complete with the slight New England accent he'd never been able to shake. Tommy, where are you? We've been waiting for you to come back. We've been waiting so long. Lane went white as hospital sheets. That's not me, he whispered. I'm standing right here. That's not me. More voices joined the hellish chorus. Rodriguez calling my name, soldiers we'd served with, people we'd known and trusted and mourned. They called to us with perfect vocal inflections, using phrases and personal references that only the real people would know. Dorian, you magnificent bastard, came Colonel Morrison's voice from the depths, our commanding officer, who'd been killed in Kazakhstan 3 years before we'd gone into cryo. Get your ass down here. We need to debrief, and you're not going to believe what we've learned. They've been listening to us, Ward realized, his medical mind putting together the pieces with horrifying clarity. All those years we were in the pods, they were there, recording our voices, our conversations, learning our speech patterns and personal histories, learning to be us. The facility's emergency lighting began strobing in patterns that seemed almost like communication, and we could hear movement in the depths below, the sound of many feet moving in perfect synchronization. The infected were waking up, responding to our presence like antibodies, responding to foreign contamination. We go back down, I decided, checking my ammunition and trying to calculate odds that didn't look good. no matter how I did the math. We end this. Sir? Lane looked at me with desperate hope still flickering in his young eyes. Maybe there are other survivors out there. Other facilities, other military installations. We could try to make contact, coordinate some kind of resistance. Look around, son. I gestured at the wasteland stretching beyond every horizon, at the twisted remains of a civilization that had lasted 10,000 years and fallen in less than a decade. There's nowhere to run to if we don't stop this here and now. Those things will keep spreading until there's nothing recognizably human left in the entire universe. The truth was, I didn't believe we could win. The mathematics were against us. 4 exhausted soldiers with limited ammunition against potentially hundreds of enhanced organisms that had been specifically designed to hunt and kill human beings. But sometimes the math didn't matter. Sometimes you fought anyway, not because you could win, but because somebody had to try. We descended back into the facility, armed with whatever weapons we could salvage from the ruins above, but the corridors that had been empty during our initial ascent now whispered with furtive movement. Shadows flitted between the dying emergency lights, always just at the edge of vision. The infected were hunting us with methodical patience, playing with us the way cats played with mice. They wanted us alive, not to preserve our lives, but to harvest our memories and personalities and everything that made us human. We were raw material for their collective consciousness, and they could afford to be patient. Sarah, came Rourke's voice from somewhere ahead of us, though she was walking right beside me. Sarah, I found a way out. Just follow my voice and everything will be okay. A figure stumbled into our flashlight beam, a perfect physical copy of Rourke, down to the scar above her left eyebrow and the way she unconsciously favoured her right leg after an old shrapnel wound. But her eyes burned with that alien crimson fire, and when she spoke, black fluid dripped from her mouth like crude oil. Please, the creature begged, and the desperation in its voice was so genuine it made my heart physically ache. It hurt so much, the thing inside me hurt so much. Please make it stop. The real Rourke put 3 rounds centre mass without the slightest hesitation, though I saw her gun hand tremble almost imperceptibly as she did it. The infected duplicate staggered under the impact but kept advancing, reaching towards us with hands that leaked black ichor from bullet wounds that should have been fatal. Briggs stepped forward and pressed his service weapon directly against the creature's temple, pulling the trigger with the mechanical precision of a man who'd been forced to make impossible choices before. It dropped like a puppet with cut strings, but even as it died, parasites began crawling out of the head wound. Dozens of them, each no bigger than a child's thumb, skittering across the floor toward our feet with predatory determination. We burned them with emergency flares from the survival kit, the chemical fire bright enough to hurt our dark adapted eyes. But not before something grabbed Lane from behind. Another duplicate. This one a twisted amalgamation of features from different soldiers, missing half its face but still possessing that terrible, inhuman strength. Briggs fought the creature hand to hand, matching strength against enhanced resilience in a contest that should have been impossible. The infected thing was faster and more flexible, but Briggs had something it lacked. Pure human rage at seeing human forms twisted into masks of alien hunger. He managed to get his hands around its throat and squeezed until something vital crunched and gave way. The infected creature smiled with its patchwork face as it died, black parasites pouring from its mouth like a river of living oil. "Sir?" came Lane's voice from the shadows behind us. But when we found his body minutes later, the change had already begun. His eyes were starting to glow with that terrible crimson light, and the wounds on his throat were sealing themselves with unnatural speed. "Tommy," the thing that had been Private Lane called after us as we ran deeper into the facility, "please don't leave me behind. I'm scared. I'm so scared." We reached the armory as the facility's power grid began its final death spiral, circuits overloading after decades of operation, beyond design specifications. In darkness broken only by our failing flashlights, we loaded up with everything we could carry. Flamethrowers, white phosphorus grenades, enough high explosives to level several city blocks. But the infected had been learning during their years in the facility. They'd observed human tactics, studied our strategies, adapted their own methods accordingly. When they came for us in the armory, they came with military precision that would have impressed our instructors back at Quantico. The first wave hit us like a coordinated military assault. Infected copies of soldiers we trained with using formations and tactical doctrines we taught them ourselves. They knew exactly how we would respond to specific threats because they were us, twisted and perfected, and utterly without human mercy or hesitation. Rourke held the left flank with a flamethrower, turning the corridor into a river of liquid fire that should have stopped any conventional assault cold. The infected charged straight through the flames, their bodies burning, but their advance never slowing for an instant. Some of them had clearly adapted, their skin glistening with some kind of natural fire retardant that protected them from weapons that had worked against earlier versions. "They're learning too fast," Ward shouted over the gunfire, bleeding from a dozen minor wounds but never stopping his methodical process of reload, aim, fire, adjust position. Every time we kill one of them, the others adapt to our tactics. Briggs maintained his heavy machine gun position at the main entrance with mechanical precision, cutting down wave after wave of infected duplicates. I could see the psychological strain etched on his face, the horror of being forced to kill creatures wearing familiar faces, even knowing they weren't really human anymore. The infected pressed their attack with suicidal determination, throwing themselves at our defensive positions without regard for casualties. For every duplicate we managed to kill, 2 more seemed to take its place, as if the facility contained an inexhaustible supply of raw material for creating more soldiers. "The reactor!" I shouted over the chaos of combat. "If we can overload the main reactor, the explosion will sterilize the entire complex." "That's a one-way trip, sir," Rourke called back, pausing in her systematic incineration of attacking duplicates to look at me with something that might have been respect. "No way we get clear of the blast radius in time." "Better than the alternative." We fought our way toward the reactor core through corridors that had become a charnel house, stepping over the remains of dozens of infected duplicates, while more poured in behind us. The infected threw themselves at us with inhuman coordination, accepting massive casualties because they understood something we were only beginning to grasp. They could always make more soldiers, but we couldn't. The reactor chamber was a cathedral of human technological achievement, a massive cylindrical structure that hummed with barely contained nuclear fire. It was beautiful in its way, a monument to human ingenuity and ambition that was now destined to become our funeral pyre. Rourke began setting shaped charges around the reactor housing, while the rest of us established a defensive perimeter, trying to buy her the time she needed to turn our own technology against the creatures that had stolen our faces. The infected pressed their attack with relentless determination, coming at us from every possible angle simultaneously, but something was wrong with their tactics. They were fighting too hard, taking too many unnecessary casualties for what should have been a simple mopping up operation against exhausted human soldiers. It wasn't until I noticed the timer on Rourke's demolition charges that I understood their strategy. They weren't trying to stop us from destroying the reactor, they were trying to delay us long enough for something else to happen. That's when I saw him stepping out from behind the reactor housing, flanked by perfect duplicates of my entire team. Another version of myself, identical in every detail except for those burning red eyes that marked him as something fundamentally other. "Hello, Dorian," my doppelganger said, and hearing my own voice speak those words was like listening to a recording of my own death sentence. "I think we need to have a conversation." The other infected stopped their attack immediately, forming a circle around us but making no aggressive moves. It was a parley conducted in the shadow of nuclear annihilation, a philosophical debate between two versions of the same man who had chosen very different definitions of survival. "You can't win this," the infected version of me continued, tilting its head with a gesture I recognized as distinctly my own. "We are you in every way that matters. We know everything you know, feel everything you feel, think every thought you've ever had. We're not your enemies, we're your evolution." "Evolution?" I spat, keeping my weapon trained on the creature that wore my face. "Your parasites wearing human faces like Halloween masks." "Are we?" The thing that looked like me smiled with what appeared to be genuine amusement. "Look around you, Dorian. Really look at what humanity has built over the centuries. Weapons designed specifically to kill other human beings. Political systems designed to concentrate power in the hands of the few. An entire civilization slowly poisoning the planet that gave it birth. Is that really worth preserving?" I looked at the infected duplicates of my team arranged around us, and for a moment I saw something in their faces that might have been contentment. They moved with fluid grace that no human could match, their wounds healing as I watched, their coordination so perfect it was like observing a single organism operating through multiple bodies. "We offer something better," the infected Hale continued softly. "No more disease, no more aging, no more meaningless death. Perfect coordination between minds, perfect communication, perfect understanding of purpose. We don't kill the host, Dorian. We liberate them from the limitations of individual existence." For one terrifying moment, I found myself actually tempted. The world above us was dead. Humanity was scattered to the winds like dust. And these creatures offered peace. Perfect, eternal peace without struggle or conflict or the constant weight of making impossible decisions. Then I looked at Ward, bleeding from a dozen wounds, but still standing his ground. At Rourke, who'd lost comrades but still found reasons to crack dark jokes in the face of death. At Briggs, gentle giant, who'd probably saved more lives than he'd taken, even in our violent profession. They were human, flawed, mortal, sometimes stupid and cruel and petty and wrong about everything that mattered. But they were human, and that had to mean something. That was all we had left, the stubborn insistence that being human meant something worth dying for. "You made one crucial mistake," I told my infected double, pulling the pin on the grenade I'd attached to my tactical harness. "What mistake is that?" it asked with what seemed like genuine curiosity. I smiled, feeling something like peace settle over me for the first time in years. "You think like me, feel like me, know everything I know, and remember everything I remember. But you don't understand the one thing that makes us truly human." The infected Hale's eyes widened in an expression of perfectly human fear. "We know when to die for something greater than ourselves." The explosion cleared a path through the infected ranks, but it also triggered their final, desperate gambit. As Ward dragged my unconscious and badly wounded form through collapsing corridors, emergency pods throughout the facility began their automated revival sequences. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, each one containing a perfect copy of someone who had once been human. We barely made it to the surface as Rourke's charges detonated in sequence, each explosion triggering the next, in a cascade of destruction. The mountain itself seemed to convulse as the reactor went critical, the blast wave expanding outward in a sphere of annihilation that consumed everything within a 3-mile radius before the shockwave dissipated across the landscape. Ward pulled me to safety behind a rocky ridge as debris rained down around us like the wrath of an angry god. When the smoke finally cleared and the radiation counters stopped clicking quite so frantically, there was nothing left but a crater filled with radioactive glass where the facility had been. "Did we get them all?" I asked through lips split and bleeding, tasting copper and ash and the bitter satisfaction of a mission completed against impossible odds. Ward was about to answer when his face went white as bone. He was looking past me, down into the wasteland that stretched beyond the ridge, and whatever he saw there made him forget how to speak. I turned to follow his gaze and felt the last of my hope die a quiet death. Figures were emerging from hidden shelters and buried installations scattered across the landscape, their eyes glowing like crimson stars in the eternal twilight. Not dozens, thousands upon thousands, maybe tens of thousands, all moving with that same perfect coordination that marked them as part of something larger than individual existence. Jesus, Ward breathed, finding his voice again. How many facilities were there? How many places like this? As we watched in horrible fascination, the infected began moving across the devastated landscape with purposeful determination. They weren't mindless hordes stumbling randomly through the ruins. They were organized, coordinated, directed by some vast intelligence that existed in the spaces between individual minds. And they were singing. It started as a low humming, barely audible, above the wind that carried radioactive dust across the poisoned earth. But as more voices joined the hellish chorus, it became something beautiful and terrible, a wordless melody that seemed to resonate in our very bones, promising peace and unity and an end to all earthly suffering. They're calling to any survivors, I realized with growing horror. Any human beings left alive will hear that song and want to investigate. They'll walk right into the arms of the infected, thinking they're being rescued. The song was hypnotic in its alien beauty, and I found myself taking an unconscious step towards the source before Ward's hand clamped down on my shoulder like a steel trap. "Don't listen to it," he said urgently. "Don't let it into your head." But it was already there, whispering promises of belonging and purpose, and an end to the loneliness that had defined human existence since the first caveman looked up at the stars and wondered why he felt so alone in an infinite universe. We limped away from the crater, two broken soldiers carrying the weight of humanity's failure on shoulders that weren't built for such a burden. Behind us, the infected continued their siren song, a lullaby for the death of our species sung in 10,000 perfect voices. "What do we do now, sir?" Ward asked as we crested another hill, putting distance between ourselves and the growing horde below. His medical training had kept him alive through 6 tours of hell, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this. I looked back at the glowing crater one last time, then at the infected spreading across the landscape, like antibodies responding to the last vestiges of human resistance. The smart tactical decision would be to find a deep hole somewhere and hide, try to survive long enough for the radiation to kill us before the parasites could get their hooks in. But I'd never been particularly smart when it came to tactical decisions. "We find other survivors," I said, checking my remaining ammunition and trying not to think about how quickly it would run out. "We teach them what we've learned about these things. We organize resistance cells and make these bastards pay for every inch of ground they take." Against that, Ward gestured at the vast horde below us. Thousands of enhanced beings moving with inhuman coordination. "Sir, they're perfect. They don't make mistakes, they don't feel fear. They learn from every encounter and adapt faster than we can compensate. How do you fight perfection?" I managed what I hoped was a confident smile, though it probably looked more like a death's head grin. "Same way we always have, Doc. One day at a time, one small victory at a time, one dead parasite at a time. They may be perfect, but perfection has its own weaknesses if you know where to look. Such as, they can't truly improvise, they can copy us, mimic us, even improve on our basic patterns, but they can't be genuinely random or unpredictable. They're a hive mind that makes them incredibly powerful, but it also makes them ultimately predictable once you understand their operating parameters." As if to prove my point, the infected below us shifted direction in perfect unison, like a flock of birds responding to some invisible signal from their collective consciousness. It was beautiful and coordinated and utterly inhuman in its mechanical precision. "Besides," I continued, "they made one crucial strategic error. that might give us an advantage. What's that? They kept us alive when they should have killed us immediately. If they were really as perfect as they claim, they would have eliminated the threat we represent without hesitation. But they wanted to study us, understand us, convert us to their cause. That means they still need something from us, something they can't just synthesize or copy from our genetic material. Ward nodded slowly, his analytical mind already working through the implications. They need our creativity, our ability to think outside established patterns, our essential humanity. Exactly, so we stay unpredictable, we stay irrational, we stay gloriously, stubbornly human, even when it would be easier to give up. The infected song grew louder as we walked, a siren call that promised rest and unity and an end to the struggle that had defined human existence since our ancestors first came down from the trees. But we kept walking anyway, two flawed and mortal human beings in a world that had been perfected beyond recognition. We walked for hours through terrain that had once been the Colorado Rockies but now resembled something from an alien world. The mountains themselves had been transformed, covered in the same bioluminescent growths we'd seen at the facility. Strange structures that might once have been trees reached toward the blood-coloured sky, their branches moving in patterns that suggested they were more than simple vegetation. As dawn approached, though the light filtering through the contaminated atmosphere was more orange than yellow, we crested a ridge and saw something that gave us both pause. Smoke. Clean smoke rising from what looked like a campfire in the valley below. Could be survivors, Ward said cautiously, but his hand moved instinctively to his sidearm. Could be a trap, I replied, though something in my chest dared to hope otherwise. Only one way to find out. We approached the camp with all the stealth two exhausted soldiers could manage, moving from cover to cover as we descended into the valley. The smoke was definitely coming from a wood fire, not the chemical burn of the infected's bioluminescent growths, but honest to God burning timber. The camp itself was small but well organized, tucked into a natural depression that would be invisible from most angles. A lean-to shelter constructed from salvaged materials, a small fire ring surrounded by stones, and sitting beside the fire, warming her hands against the morning chill, was a woman in her 30s with prematurely grey hair and eyes that had seen too much. She looked up as we approached, and I saw her hand move towards a rifle propped against a nearby rock, but after studying our faces for a long moment, she relaxed slightly. "You're human," she said simply. "Real human. I can tell by the way you move, you're not coordinated enough to be one of them." Dr. Elena Vasquez, she introduced herself as we settled around the fire. Formerly of the CDC's Special Pathogens Branch, currently the last member of what used to be a research team of 47 people. She had a story to tell, and it wasn't a happy one. "We were studying the infection when it first appeared," she explained, poking at the fire with a charred stick, trying to understand its transmission vectors, its biological mechanisms, its potential weaknesses. What we found was disturbing doesn't begin to cover it. According to Vasquez, the parasites weren't from Earth at all. They'd been discovered in ice core samples from Antarctica, frozen for millions of years until climate change had melted enough ice to release them into groundwater systems. "They're not even technically alive in the way we understand life," she continued. "They're more like biological machines. Incredibly sophisticated ones that can interface with organic neural networks and reprogram them for their own purposes." "Reprogram how?" Ward asked, his medical background making him the natural point man for technical discussions. "They don't just infect the brain, they improve it, enhance neural efficiency, increase processing speed, eliminate the biochemical basis for emotions, like fear and doubt, and individual self-interest. From their perspective, they're not killing humans, they're perfecting us." "And from our perspective?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "From our perspective, they're committing genocide, because what makes us human isn't our intelligence or our problem-solving ability, it's our flaws, our irrationality, our capacity for individual choice, even when it goes against the collective good. She had data collected during the early stages of the infection before her research facility had been overrun. The parasites were incredibly intelligent, capable of rapid evolution and adaptation. They learned from every encounter, sharing information instantly across their collective network, and they were spreading exponentially, not just through direct infection, but through active conversion of suitable host organisms. "How many of them are there now?" Ward asked. Vasquez's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Conservative estimates, maybe 2 billion infected worldwide. They've had 30 years to spread and multiply. Every major population center, every military installation, every government facility, all of them are compromised." The numbers were staggering, but what made it worse was the infected's strategic intelligence. They hadn't just randomly attacked human civilization. They'd systematically targeted leadership, infrastructure, and communication networks. They'd crippled humanity's ability to coordinate resistance before most people even knew there was a threat. "There are other survivors," Vasquez assured us, "small groups scattered across the world, trying to stay hidden and human. But we're not organized. We don't have communication networks or supply lines or any kind of central command structure. We're just individual cells trying to survive long enough to matter." "Then we organize them," I said with more confidence than I felt. "We build networks, establish communication protocols, create the infrastructure for sustained resistance." "With what resources?" Vasquez asked pointedly. "The infected control every factory, every power grid, every transportation system on the planet. They have unlimited manufacturing capacity and perfect coordination. What do we have?" "We have something they don't," Ward said quietly. "We have the ability to surprise them, to do things they wouldn't expect because they're not perfectly logical." Over the next several hours, we shared information and tried to develop something resembling a plan. Vasquez had been monitoring radio frequencies for months, collecting fragments of communication from other survivor groups. There were resistance cells operating in the ruins of major cities, hidden communities in remote wilderness areas, even some military units still maintaining operational capability, but they were all isolated, all struggling with the same problems: limited resources, constant threat of discovery, and the psychologically devastating reality that they were fighting a war they couldn't possibly win through conventional means. "We need to change the nature of the conflict," I realized as we discussed various tactical scenarios. "Stop trying to fight them on their terms and force them to fight on ours." "Meaning what exactly?" Vasquez asked. "Meaning we stop trying to match their technological superiority and start exploiting their weaknesses. They're a collective intelligence that makes them powerful, but it also makes them vulnerable to certain types of attack." I had the beginnings of an idea, something that would require careful planning and incredible luck to pull off. But it was better than just running and hiding until the infected finally tracked us down. "They need to understand us in order to replicate us effectively," I explained. "That's why they keep some humans alive. We're their research subjects. But what if we could feed them false information? Make them think they understand human behavior when actually they're working from corrupted data?" The plan that emerged over the next few days was ambitious to the point of insanity. We would establish a network of survivor communities, but instead of trying to hide from the infected, we would deliberately make contact with them. Let ourselves be studied and partially converted, but not completely. "You're talking about going undercover among beings that can read our thoughts," Vasquez pointed out. "How exactly do you propose to maintain operational security under those circumstances?" "We don't hide our thoughts," Ward said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "We control them, feed them specific information while keeping the important stuff buried deep enough that they can't access it without complete conversion." It was possible, according to Vasquez's research. The parasites needed time to fully integrate with human neural networks. During the early stages of infection, hosts retained significant individual identity, and could potentially maintain hidden thoughts and motivations. It would be incredibly dangerous, she warned. The conversion process is irreversible after a certain point. If you wait too long to extract the intelligence you've gathered, you'll lose yourself completely. How long do we have? I asked. Variable. Depends on individual, neurochemistry, psychological resilience and the specific strain of parasite involved. Anywhere from weeks to months before complete integration occurs. It wasn't much of a window, but it was something. And given the alternatives, slow extinction through attrition or quick extinction through direct confrontation, it seemed like our best option for gathering the intelligence we'd need to mount effective resistance. We spent the next week preparing for what would essentially be a suicide mission, with a very small chance of survival and an even smaller chance of meaningful success. Vasquez had maps of infected facilities, intelligence on their operational patterns, and most importantly, locations where other survivor groups were still maintaining resistance. Remember, she said as we prepared to separate, she would head east to make contact with survivors in the ruins of Denver, while Ward and I moved south towards suspected infected installations in New Mexico. The moment you feel yourself starting to lose individual identity, you extract. Don't try to be heroes. The information you gather is only valuable if someone survives to use it. We parted ways at dawn, 3 broken humans, carrying the weight of our species' survival on shoulders that weren't built for such responsibility. But we carried it anyway because someone had to try. As Ward and I made our way through the transformed landscape toward our first objective, I found myself thinking about the nature of humanity and what it meant to be truly human in a world that had been perfected beyond recognition. Maybe the infected were right. Maybe they were offering genuine improvement, elimination of suffering, perfect coordination, an end to the loneliness and conflict that had defined human existence since the beginning. Maybe resistance was just stubborn attachment to outdated biological imperatives. But as I watched Ward check his equipment with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent his life saving others, I knew that wasn't true. The infected could copy our memories, replicate our skills, even improve upon our physical capabilities, but they couldn't replicate the essential spark that made us choose to keep fighting even when victory was impossible. That spark, that gloriously irrational human capacity for hope, in the face of hopeless odds, was worth preserving, even if it killed us, especially if it killed us. The war for humanity's soul had just begun, and we were going to fight it one impossible battle at a time until there was nothing left to fight for, or nothing left to fight with. But we were going to fight, because that's what humans do.